Hi, everyone. Welcome to Caraconference 2023, brought to you by Caracole. We are Greater Cincinnati's HIV service organization devoted to positively changing lives in the fight against HIV/AIDS. And on to our session. We are so excited to spend the next hour with each and every one of you. I'm going to introduce our CEO, Linda Sider.
Thanks, Suzanne, and welcome everyone. We're so pleased to have you here today. This is our 6th annual CARE conference, and this year we have a wide range of topics from cutting-edge HIV medical research, innovative testing strategies, and the impact of the legal system on public health. We have representatives today joining us on this webinar from a multi-state region, including Illinois, Texas, Maine, Florida, Pennsylvania, and of course, Ohio, and others. So welcome to our out-of-town visitors. And again, we're just so happy to have you all here today. Today, we're pleased to have Dr. Carl Fichtenbaum, who I'm introducing from the Division of Infectious Diseases at the University of Cincinnati. He'll be presenting on his exciting research to find new approaches to treating HIV and to work towards a cure. First of all, Dr. Fichtenbaum has been a leader in the forefront of treatment and research in the field of HIV for many years. He's a practicing physician, a musician, and has seen enormous changes in the care of those living with HIV, many of whom are Caracole clients. For years, I've heard from so many of our clients firsthand, from the people we serve, the impact he has on their lives. If you are lucky enough to have Dr. Fichtenbaum as your doctor, you have a skilled physician, an advocate, and a cheerleader. Dr. Fichtenbaum brings his humanity to the care of those he serves. When I first met him many years ago, we were discussing current treatments at the time, and this was a couple of decades ago. And I remember that he said, now that HIV is a manageable disease, we need to help our clients realize their dreams. Ever since then, I have had a huge respect for him. Again, I love the fact that he is so skilled as a physician and such a humanitarian and sees each of his patients as individuals. So we're really lucky to have him as our partner in this work and here today. Also, I want to introduce John Causey, who is part of the Trailblazing study and has been a Caracole supporter for many years and a good friend to our agency. So with that, I want to turn it over to Carl.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and happy Monday to everyone. I know it is September 11th, and of course, September 11th is a day that goes down in the memory of many of us. And I think it's really fortunate that we're here talking with Caracole and all of its supporters and advocates and interested parties to talk a little bit about something that I think is very, very important, which is how can we get to a better place in treating HIV, and how can we get to a place where we can someday cure HIV? I always was a little bit reluctant to talk about that word, to mention that word, because I felt like it was something that we should be very cautious about, not to give people false hope. But I do think that dreams are very important and hope is very important. And so talking about cure is exactly what we should be doing in HIV, and working as hard as we can to find solutions and get there. So today, our objectives will be to talk a little bit about this understanding of the one study that we were doing, and to talk about how evidence of what we do will make a difference, and how we can engage the community and learn about these findings and talk a little bit more. And I didn't know if it was possible for me to share my screen at all with my slide set, which I did a couple of tweaks on. Is that at all possible? If not,
it is, yes.
If not, we can do yours, but All right.
If you, do you have the ability to share them right now? We'll make you co-host and then you can.
Yep, I got it.
Awesome.
You should be seeing it right now on your screen, and I'll make it even bigger here in a second. So everybody should see it very nicely on their screen. Is that working okay?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So searching for a cure, what will it take? Well, first of all, just so you know, in full disclosures, I do receive research grants that go to the University of Cincinnati from Gilead, Merck, Moderna, and ViiV to do research. And I've also been an advisor for ViiV and Theratechnologies within the last year. And I also received funding from the NIH to do studies to try and help gain new knowledge. Okay, so HIV cure. So what are we talking about here? Well, you know, our medications have been really useful, pretty amazing. Many years ago, most of my patients would not survive, and it was very frustrating, very depressing, very sad for them and their families. But with the onset of the cocktail, one of my favorite meetings was going to the Vancouver International AIDS meeting, the World AIDS meeting, and where we heard presentations about these new powerful medications that we called the cocktail. And they made a huge difference. But our HIV medications do not get rid of HIV completely, so that if you're a person with HIV and you stop your medicines, the virus usually comes right back. And so I know this can be scary for some people to see graphs and curves, but I'm going to walk you through this pretty straightforward. But what happens to people is they have a very high virus level when they are initially discovered to have HIV or they're newly infected. And when we start our treatment, which we call combination antiretroviral therapy, because HIV is a retrovirus, not retro like we all like when we go to retro nights and we dress up in the 70s and there's like
Dr. Fichtenbaum, I'm sorry to interrupt, but is there any way you could put your slides on presentation? So we can see
yeah,
the
sorry.
slide? Thank you so
my
much.
bad. I forgot about that minor little thing there.
Thank
So
you.
found it. It was hiding. All right. So this combination antiretroviral therapy that we give people leads the virus levels to drop very, very quickly when we measure it on blood tests. And it is very predictable, drops really, really low. The problem is if you stop taking your medicines, the virus comes right back. And we understand a lot about how this works and where the virus is infecting different cells. Because basically the virus is a guest that we invite to dinner and never wants to leave. It's the worst house guest we ever have. And so it gets into our cells and it just won't go away. So here's a really, really complicated slide that I'll take you through pretty straightforward. Here's our little fun cartoon of the HIV virus and what it does to first get into somebody's body, get into the cells, and then it does something really weird. It gets into these cells and we call them resting cells. These are cells that live in our bodies for up to 60 years. They're important because these are cells that have a memory. They remember different germs that we're exposed to when we're little kids. And if we get exposed to them when we're adults, they wake up, they activate, they help us out. But what happens is these cells, when they wake up, can produce virus and can infect new cells in our body. And that's not really what we want to have happen. So when this happens, our immune system gets turned on, it gets activated, and our body is not feeling as good. My patients best describe this as, you know, I feel tired more than I should feel. And that is very common. So these resting cells are the source of where virus hides for many, many years, and why it's very hard for us to get rid of it. And what we say is HIV establishes what we call a reservoir, or a place where it lives indefinitely. And it happens within weeks of being infected. And this, every now and then, these cells wake up, but there are many of these cells all over our body, and it leads to the virus reproducing itself over and over again. All right. So what do we know? The reservoir, or this place where HIV hides, is the real barrier for us curing it. We've got to get rid of the reservoir. And so what that means is what we call a sterilizing cure, that we would permanently remove HIV, all parts of it, and get rid of the reservoir. But we've also thought about another way to look at cure, which we call functional cure, which is we could permanently stop the virus from making new copies of itself, but not have people on treatment, such that it would not affect their immune system, and they wouldn't be able to transmit HIV, that concept U equal U. And in fact, that's a real functional cure. So people don't have to take medicine, but yet we still control them. And that's what we're sort of aiming for nowadays in 2023. So what do we know about this virus? Well, we know that the virus has keys to our cells or to our house. So the virus has to get inside the house or the cell in order for it to do its thing, right? So in order to do that, it has to have a special key, and it has to have a lock that's on the cell. Well, here's this funny looking squiggly lock called CCR5. It's got a fancy name. And what that is basically a lock where the virus fits right in there and can get in the cell. Now, there's other keys, different ones, but this is the main one. And this is the most what we call common co-receptor. Now, what's funny about this is that if we change this in some way, if it gets mutated as a random act of nature, and in fact, it does mutate in about 1% of people who are from Europe. And we think that's related to the plague of the 1300s, 1400s, that people somehow developed a mutation as a way to try and prevent them from getting sick from the plague. Well, it turns out it helps with this HIV virus plague of the 20th and 21st centuries. When it's mutated, the virus cannot get in. Essentially, what we're doing is changing the locks on our house or the surface of our cell, and people are resistant to HIV infection. So we've known this for a while. And this is Timothy Brown. Tim passed away a few years ago, and he and I were at a meeting together, and so we took pictures. Very nice man. He was a school teacher, and he was known as the Berlin patient. He was the first person who got cured through a very fancy thing called the bone marrow transplant. And here is the article talking about this cure back in 2011, which had to do with that special lock on the cell, the CCR5 receptor or key to the cell. And here's what happened to Tim. He was 40 years old. He had had HIV for 10 years. He had been on treatment for 4 years. His CD4 counter T cells were about 415, which aren't bad, and he had an undetectable virus level. So by modern standards, we were controlling his HIV with our medications, and he was doing pretty well. And then, unfortunately, he got diagnosed with leukemia. That's really bad. So what happened was he needed chemotherapy, and he had his HIV treatment stopped briefly, but he got his chemotherapy And unfortunately, his leukemia relapsed. So despite getting chemotherapy, it just didn't work. And that's not uncommon with people with leukemia. So then Tim got a bone marrow transplant, but his doctors were very, very smart. They knew about this special key on the surface of cells, and they said, what if we find somebody who could donate their bone marrow to Tim, but their bone marrow would be resistant to HIV infection? So he got a bunch of fancy medications, and these are very powerful medicines that really suppress your immune system. And he got what we call a blood stem cell transplant or a bone marrow transplant, but the donor was what we call homozygous, or they had this mutation so that they did not have the CCR5 gene like other people. And he got the bone marrow, it worked, and it was complicated by a little bit of rejection, which is common with bone marrow transplants. And unfortunately, after almost a year, the leukemia relapsed, and he had to get another bone marrow transplant, which he got a little more than a year after the first one. He got the second one. And here's what happened after he got that second bone marrow transplant. He was on his HIV medications. His virus level was down really, really low. And then he stopped his medication sometime in 2007. And then over the next several years, they looked for HIV where they could find it everywhere in his body. He was very generous. They did biopsies. They took cerebrospinal fluid or did a spinal tap. And they checked his blood carefully. And they could not find HIV in his body like he would have had before. And so then they reported that, in fact, he was the first person that we called cured from HIV, in that he did not have to take any medicines. And by all the tests that we normally do to look for HIV, we couldn't find it. Well, there were other people that came after Tim. So there was the London patient, the Dusseldorf patient, a Minnesota patient, and there were other patients as well. And each of these individuals had something similar in common. These people all had some kind of cancer, except for the Mississippi baby, which was a unique situation where this was a little baby that had gotten started on treatment. And of course, that treatment then got interrupted. Now, eventually that baby did relapse. It just took a really long time. But with all of these individuals, what we saw was something very similar, which is if we were able to give them a change in the what we call that key or that CCR5 gene, if we're able to get rid of that and give them a bone marrow transplant, we are able to control the HIV without having to use medications. So here now we've proved this in multiple circumstances, but this only happens when we're giving somebody a bone marrow or stem cell transplant. Now, here's the cautionary part of the tale. Here are some reports of people who got bone marrow transplants, but this time they didn't get the gene changed completely. It was only halfway changed, and it didn't work. Those people relapsed very quickly. So it showed us that we really have to get a bone marrow transplant where the gene is changed. And we also looked for people here who got other sorts of transplants, some of whom got it where there was this change, and they unfortunately died from it. So remember, bone marrow transplants are very, very dangerous things to happen. And there was a person here who was, what we had was a donor who had this gene thing, and still that individual did not survive. So I think that that's really important for us to understand that while this worked in some people, it has not worked in everyone, and there can be some really serious consequences. So the summary is that it is very expensive to do a bone marrow transplant. It costs more than $500,000 per transplant. And it's hard to find people who have this mutation that occurs naturally that matches what you need when you need a bone marrow transplant. There's lots of side effects from bone marrow transplants. And even though Tim was cured for a while and lived for probably another decade after his bone marrow transplant or so, he eventually, his body was worn down and he did pass away. So it's a good thing that we've learned from this, but we know that this bone marrow transplant thing is not going to be what we can do for everyone with HIV. And it's not what we should be doing because it is very dangerous. So what are other ways that we could approach curing people? Well, there's this whole idea of shock and kill, which still sounds terrible. It's like one of those TV shows on the Life Channel, where you see all these, terrible person kill somebody or something like that. But what we want to try and do is kind of wake up that reservoir of HIV and get rid of HIV. There are vaccines that we've talked about giving people to maybe pump our immune system up like other vaccines. And then there are these broadly neutralizing antibodies, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And then there's the study that we did, which is modifying T cells. And there are different technologies to use for that. One is called CRISPR. You may have heard that in the news before, but it is a special technique in the laboratory where we can modify genes. And then there is this whole emerging area called CAR T cells. That's the living drug. You may have heard about it on the news a few years back. It's a medication that we often use to cure cancers. And we can make these CAR T cells in a way in which they can attack HIV. So what's the whole shock and kill thing? Well, the whole idea that I mentioned before is we have these cells that have HIV, but are essentially, they're invisible to our immune system. They're just sleeping. So the idea of the shock is activate these cells, make them available to be a target. And then we can try to kill them with specific cells that are these fighting cells. And that way we can kind of get rid of it. And here's my little cartoon, which kind of shows how we use some medicine to shock the cell to get it to activate. And then we get the immune system and we hype it up and we try to break that cell and kill it that has the HIV, but not other cells. And then we can hopefully protect ourselves with some medications, and then other cells don't get infected. However, we've done 45 or more studies, and this shock and kill thing is not working. Sometimes we can wake up cells, we can shock them. Sometimes we can clear cells, but we haven't been able to efficiently do both at the same time. And so this is a good idea, but it hasn't really panned out. There's now these monoclonal antibodies that we call bNAbs, meaning that these are antibodies. And the one I'm talking about here is in red here, this N6 antibody. And this is an antibody that is being used in studies. In fact, at the University of Cincinnati, we're about to start a study using this antibody. And this antibody is very effective in controlling HIV. Antibodies, what they do are they find a target and they coat that target, kind of like you're painting over a wall type of thing. And they make it possible for the immune system to do its thing and really control HIV. And what we've seen with this one particular antibody, and this is a whole panel of different antibodies, is it seems to work in a lot of different situations, about 96 to 98% of the time. So these broadly neutralizing antibodies, we've used them in many studies, but what we found are that even though we give them to people, we can't really stop the HIV treatment. What happens is HIV finds a way to get around these antibodies. So now we've shifted our gears a little bit to try and figure out, could we give these medicines every few months and maybe combine them with some other things so that people don't have to take pills every day. And this might be a way of more safely controlling HIV. So stay tuned on that. We're still working on that possibility. Now, the study that we're doing here in Cincinnati and also in San Francisco and in Cleveland at Case Western has a really long name, but we call it the TRAILBLAZER study. And what this is we are taking cells and genetically modifying them using this special technology and then giving them back to the same person. So here's how it works. Here's your arm here. We draw your blood. We collect a bunch of blood on you. And then we take this blood and we use some special techniques and we target the gene. We target the CCR5 gene. And what we do is we then remove that gene from those cells. And then in the laboratory, we make the cells grow up a little bit more. And then we give them back to the person in an infusion. So we're essentially giving you back your own cells, but the difference is we modified them by removing one gene. It's really kind of an amazing technology when you think about human beings, and we used to live in caves, and now we can modify genes within our own body. It's pretty amazing. So this uses a technique called zinc finger nuclease. And it's just a way of breaking something up, getting rid of a specific area. And then the body has this special enzyme that kind of repairs things. Much like a sewing machine, it just sews it right back in. So what we've done is we've removed that one gene we wanted to get rid of, and then we sew the area back up, and then the gene still works. That's how that technology works. And here's our study. We enrolled 30 people. In arm 1, 20 people got those modified cells. And in arm 2, we gave them back their cells, but the gene was not removed. Now, why do we do this? Well, because in science, it's very important for us to compare things to see whether there's some natural variation that might happen to people that is not explained by what we're doing, versus when you randomize people, then we have a better sense of, is the intervention that I'm doing really making a difference? So we got lots of blood on people. We did lots of testing at the beginning. We did biopsies of various areas, lymph nodes, intestinal biopsies. We even collected spinal fluid on some people. We gave them a medicine that's like a chemotherapy medicine so that they would accept these cells back in their body, not dosing like cancer, but just so that they would accept the cells. And then we've been following people for basically up to 2 years. So this study will actually finish in December. The last person will finish. There were 14 people from Cincinnati, 10 from Cleveland, and 6 from San Francisco, collecting all these samples over time. And our question really is, if we modify these cells and give them back to people, will we be able to get rid of some of that reservoir? And is it going to be enough that we can get closer to a cure? I think that's a really important question for us to try and answer. Now, is there any hope from this technology? Well, here is an example of some hope. So this is a study that was done years before using the same technology, and they gave people this same modification of cells. And over here, you see this pretty color with all these nice dots and numbers. And basically what we're seeing is over time, the amount of HIV in a person's body started going down in some of these individuals. What we found that was very interesting was it was associated with the cells here in red that we're going to call RORA cells. These are cells that were basically the modified cells given back to people that persisted for a really long time. And one person here in purple has actually been off medications for 5 years, and their HIV is very well controlled. And they have lots of these RORA cells in their body. So it kind of gives us hope that maybe this technology that we're testing in our study is doing something. But there's a but. Okay. So this same study was reported by Dr. Pablo Tabas back in 2014, and they did the very same thing, but they did it a little differently. What they did was they modified the cells, gave them back to people, and then within about a month of giving it to them said, stop taking your HIV medicines. And I think that this is important because it may be that we have to keep these cells in our body for a while till they transform to these RORA cells before we consider stopping medicine. I think that maybe we stopped it too soon because all these people rebounded and we didn't really cure their HIV. Their virus levels went up, they went back on medicine, and their virus levels went down. But it does show that these cells will persist for a long time, and that's important. So I think there is also something from the community, and this goes back to pre-pandemic, but I think it's important. And Greg Gonsalves has been a advocate for people with HIV for many, many years. And he said, HIV is not going away anytime soon. I've been living with it for more than 20 years, and I've seen the overhyped stories promising cure around the corner pop up regularly, particularly around the big AIDS conferences. And he was talking about the second person, or the London patient, who got cured, when he said they've gone into long-term remission after one of these bone marrow transplants. And it's a real scientific advance, but I fear the sensationalism with which this report received could do more harm than good, because it obscures the daily actual struggles we face in combating the epidemic. And I think this is still true today. It's good that we're looking for a cure, but we also still have to remember that many people are struggling with their HIV today. So really, curing HIV is going to probably require a lot of different approaches. We're going to have to figure out how we can stop HIV from reproducing itself in the entire body, everywhere, not just the bloodstream, but in all nooks, crannies, and corners and crevices. We're going to have to figure out how we wake up these cells that are infected with HIV, that are sitting there resting, so we can get rid of them. And clearing HIV will likely require that our immune system gets revved up, and we have to make sure that this is safe for us to do. So I wanted to stop there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we don't have this big black screen. And either I'm going to let John talk and then we'll answer questions, or I'm not exactly sure, but I'll turn it back over to Suzanne for a minute.
Yeah, that sounds great, John. If you want to go ahead and talk, and please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll go through those after John's done.
Okay. Well, thank you all for having me here this morning, and well, this afternoon. Well, speaking of 9/11, it was in 2001 that I came under Dr. Fichtenbaum's care, and I had moved here from Detroit. I had been HIV positive at that time for 10 years and never had any care whatsoever. So his first question to me was, do you believe in God? And when I said, yeah, he's like, well, God put us together today. And if you just listen to me, will make you feel a whole lot better. Well, I feel a whole lot better because I listened to him, and we had our discussions, and I always had issues, but that was back when we took handfuls of pills and had to drink gallons and gallons of water. And one of my issues was, well, instead of drinking 2 gallons of water, can I drink like a gallon and a half and then have a couple of beers to make up that other half a gallon? And we would go back and forth with that. But over the years, we we did it, and I'm a whole lot better. I feel a whole lot better. We've come a long ways. So, and also with Caracole as well, because they took very good care of me. Their staff, the infectious disease staff, they all took care of me. They treated me like royalty, and they still do. They're really nice, good people. So when the research comes up, I've done several research studies with them. Some good, some bad, and the reason I do them is because back when we did have to take those handfuls of pills and drink all that water, I mean, it makes you feel better with the HIV part, but then it gives you like other problems. So that's the things that we were trying to eliminate. We want to get you well or make you feel better and get you healthy, but without all the side effects. So that's one of the reasons why I do the research, because we need to weed out the side effects and all that. And so far, we're doing a good job on that. And it also gets us closer to a cure. As far as the Trailblazer study, gosh, my mind just went blank there for a minute. I couldn't think of the name of it. It really impressed me because like they were taking out my blood cells, and then they're doing, as I thought, they were like putting little shields around them so they couldn't reproduce them and put them back in. They would freeze them or whatever. And that kind of fascinated me a little bit. Like, wow, that's cool. And I just wanted to see and be a part of that and see how it worked, and also to get us a good bit closer to a cure as well. It took like 2 years, and well, it was also like doing dialysis because they took all your blood out. They went through all your blood and got all your cells. Like you said, they found them all in the deep crevices or whatever. You be there for all day. And then, they show you the little bag with your blood cells in there, the ones that they're keeping. And that's kind of interesting. I mean, I like science, so that's kind of interesting. And to see what the technology that they can do this with, and it was cool. Do you need me to elaborate more or what? Because that's probably.
So, John, was there any part that made you nervous about participating in this study? Made you worry?
Well, with this study and every study, you never know what the outcome's going to be or what it's going to do to you. It's like, my doctor's a mad scientist. But I trust Dr. Fichtenbaum. He is my doctor. He's been my doctor for 22 years. And I trust him. So when he says, I think you'll be good for this, or I got a lot of confidence in him. But like I say, the only thing is you never know what's going on. So it's like you just, like on a roller coaster, you get all the way up to the top, and then that first drop, it's going to be something. Is it going to be scary? Is it going to be exciting? So it's just, you take that.
Research can be that way. It can be kind of scary for people too. And they're oftentimes, people think of themselves as guinea pigs, or, we're experimenting on them.
Yeah.
But I'm really glad that people like you are curious and interested in trying to find a solution, because you're the real heroes of all of these things, because you take the time and you make yourself available and you try things. And that's so important. So I really appreciate that, and I'm very thankful.
Well, I'm glad to do it because, like I said, back when we took those handfuls of medicine and the side effects, so now we're getting rid of the side effects. So that the people behind me don't have to have those side effects. They can just feel better and not worry about it. So it helps out everybody in the long run.
Yeah. And
Thank
I
you.
also think it's really, really important that we have all different shapes and sizes and backgrounds of people in studies, because we have to know if things work for everyone. So
Right.
I think that's important. So I always appreciate your interest. And I also appreciate when you give me a hard time too. I think that's really good.
You give me a hard time. But
We
it's
have some questions in the Q&A if you two
All
are
right.
open to answering them.
Sure.
Okay.
okay.
Kimberly from Equitas is wondering, is there a place to find out what studies are being done or about to begin that clients can access?
Yeah, there is. Sorry if John, you can pipe in too, but I can put in the chat where a phone number people can call to talk to our research coordinator. Our website is not quite up to date these days. Otherwise, I would give you that too as well. But there are certainly different studies that one can do. There are also some interesting national websites. So there's something called the Red Ribbon Registry, which is for people who have HIV infection, are looking for studies. You can become a part of that and you can get referred to different studies in all parts of the country as well. And then there are also places like that are a little harder to search called clinicaltrials.gov, where you can look for studies that might be of interest to you. But I'm going to put in the chat the name and phone number where people can access things. John, did you want to add something to that?
Well, I was just going to say in the greater Cincinnati area, they can also go to the community advisory board meetings, which happen every second Thursday of the month at 5 o'clock. And that they'll get all that information of all the studies that would be coming up or that are going on at the time. So, they'll get a hands-on, like, okay, we're right here, we're discussing it, and get more information about that study as well. So,
Good point, John.
Thank you both. Our next question, I'm just going to spell these words out. Does the Trailblazer study pertain to CART, BN, ABS, or both?
So the Trailblazer study doesn't really pertain to those. So there are no CAR T cells, and there are no broadly neutralizing antibodies in that study. This is just a gene study where we're basically taking a scissors and clipping out this one gene in a person, giving them back those cells to see whether or not we can decrease the amount of HIV in a person's body.
Thank you. Next question. Is there a way to find out if you have the CCR5 gene to be a donor?
Yeah, so you can get genetic testing for that. It's not very common. And it is not something that's always done as just like I can go to my doctor's office and order gene testing. But there are different services that offer genetic testing. And sometimes you can check and see if they can tell you whether or not you have a mutation in that particular cell, so you could potentially be a donor. Certainly, people can volunteer to be bone marrow transplant donors. And I cannot remember the name of the website for that, but there is, I think at the Hawksworth Center, they have information about how to become a donor there.
Great, thank you. Next question is, has there been any research to see if there are any similar gene mutations resistant to HIV in populations outside of European descent?
Oh, that's a great question. So people have looked in sub-Saharan Africa for other genes that might be associated with this. So far, we haven't really found anything that's been like the CCR5 gene. There have been groups of individuals who've been exposed a lot to HIV and don't seem to catch it. And we've been trying to study them really hard, but we haven't found a specific mutation like that. So there has been some looking, but we haven't found anything similar.
Okay, can you briefly go over the analytical treatment interruption?
Oh yeah. Okay. So the whole idea of an analytical treatment interruption, or ATI, means that when you do a study, that if we want to see if we're trying to do something to lower the amount of HIV or cure HIV, the proof of the pudding is stopping HIV treatment. And so what we do is we try to do this very carefully. We put somebody in a study, and then we will stop medications. And then every single week, we will bring them back to carefully check for signs that if the HIV is coming back. And that is a very careful way of making sure people don't get sick because their HIV starts to come back. And I think the important thing to recognize too, when we interrupt treatment, if HIV comes back and comes back to a high enough level, more than 1,000, more than 10,000 copies, it's possible then for people to pass HIV accidentally to someone else in the same way that HIV is normally passed. And so we want to make sure in these analytic treatment interruptions that we are carefully talking to people about how you feel, is the virus coming back, and is there any risk for you having sex with someone else and accidentally transmitting HIV. So that's, in brief, the analytic treatment interruptions. I will say, over the years, taking care of many, many patients for 30 plus years, there are lots of people who stop taking their medicines all on their own, and they do their own little mini experiments. John could probably comment on that better than I could.
Well, I never stopped taking mine, so. But I have been undetectable for what, 23 years now? So I'm good with that. But it does get tiring sometimes just taking those pills every day. But my doctor got me from taking like 20 pills twice a day to taking just one pill a day. And, you know, that's, hey, I'm good with that. So we are progressing a lot.
Okay, I have a series of questions here from Mark, who is at Columbus Public Health. What is the median age of the study, as well as the racial and gender breakdown of study participants? And then, is there an effort to recruit study participants not generally represented in clinical research?
Yeah, so this study, because it uses a medicine that's like a chemotherapy, we had to be very careful about enrolling women. So this study did not actually enroll any women because we didn't want to take any chance that we might cause any harm. So this is a study of all men. So not fully representative. Absolutely. Also, the study has about 30 to 35% people of non-white background enrolled in it. So not completely representative as it should be in all of our studies, but there is some differential representation. And the median age, I can't really tell you exactly, but it's probably somewhere around like 45 to 50 years. So this is a much older population than say, like 20-year-olds or that kind of thing. And it was mainly because we are looking for people who have very well controlled HIV and were generally pretty healthy, who could tolerate this study. Those are great questions, and we definitely try to look for representation, particularly people who come from different ethnic and racial backgrounds, women, and so many of our other studies are doing much better on that front. The HIV epidemic in the United States has about 30% or so women, and so we try as best we can to try and include about that number of women in each of our studies. And for many of the other studies that we do where there isn't any danger related to pregnancy or breastfeeding, we are much better at recruiting women in studies.
Thank you. I'm going to combine these next two questions. So does this mean HIV can never be cured, or is it with us forever with all of the advance in science and technology? Basically, what is the future? Is there a cure for HIV in the horizon?
So I never like to say never. I'm sure people never thought we would put somebody on the moon. I didn't know that we would have a crazy pandemic like we had in 2020, right? Right. It's really hard to predict the future. I am an eternal optimist, and I'm very hopeful that someday we will be able to find a cure, or certainly a way in which we can eliminate the need for people having to take medication every single day or daily to control HIV. So I think it's possible, but like many other questions in science, we often bang our head against the wall 100 billion times before we find an answer. So I'm hopeful, but I'm realistic that this is going to take time, and science is one of those things like kind of watching the grass grow. It takes a while before we get an answer.
All right, we have two questions left. So this person is asking if you can talk more about what a double-blind study is.
Yeah, sure. So the most important thing about science is trying to get at what we consider the truth today. Now, remember, truth always changes, and it's often in the eye of the beholder. But to get the best scientific answer, we really need to try and flip a coin and have some people get an intervention and some people get some sort of dummy thing that we call a placebo. And it works best if people don't know, like me, the leader of the study or a doctor. I don't know what people got in TRAILBLAZER. I don't. It's blinded. And it's better if the people who are going through it don't know, because it turns out that when we do know things, we often react to that, how we feel, our behavior changes. And so by doing a double-blind study, it means the participant doesn't know, the treaters don't know, who are assessing things, and we then usually randomize people to different groups, and then we follow them over time to see what happens. Now, does anybody know? Of course, yes, there are always safeguards. Someone knows. And if something goes wrong, we can break the blind or break the code. That way we can see, is there something that might be causing a person harm? So this is a very powerful tool that takes a lot of the bias out of studies and lets us understand, is what we're doing really making a difference? And is it safe?
Thank you. And we'll go to our last question now, which is, how long do you think the new gene has to be back into the body before one would be able to stop ART? I remember you mentioned another study and they stopped after 1 month, and that may have been too soon.
Yeah, okay, so me and my scientist friends who've been working on this study been arguing about this for 4 to 5 years. I actually think that people like John would need to have a couple of treatments so that we kind of build up these cells to a specific level. We don't know what the right level is. And I think it probably needs to be there for a little while, that it probably needs to be there for, maybe a year or two before we really see the benefits start to happen. And at that point in time, that's what we really want to try and understand. And in fact, we are designing some new studies to actually answer these questions directly. How much do we need? How long does it have to be there? And can we then measure the amount of HIV in a person's body? And if it drops by a certain amount, can we then stop their treatment and see if that becomes safe? So I think that it's a really outstanding question. We don't have all the answers to that, but I think that a month or two is way too soon. But I don't know the exact timing, and that's what we hope to figure out in the coming years as we're testing all these new different ways of looking at cure.
Thank you. I just want to thank John for being here, and Dr. Fichtenbaum. Your wisdom, knowledge, experience has been really helpful. An incredible presentation. And we hope to see you all tomorrow. Same time, same place. We will be hosting a panel of experts who are going to be talking about harm reduction and IPV. So thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon. We'll see you tomorrow.